Click for IB Biology. Here we're looking at techniques to estimate the size of mobile species, and for the greater part here we're referring to animal species. There's a blank version of this presentation linked into the description. You can annotate that PDF with your own notes. There's 10 questions there as well with answers, and I've also put in there an AI prompt. You can cut and paste that into a chatbot, and that would individualize some learning for you. So let's look at this technique that we're going to use to estimate animal populations. And our animal that we're going to estimate the population for is the wood mouse, and this is the typical habitat of a wood mouse in some ancient woodland in the Lake District of England. The technique is known as capture, mark, and recapture, which gives a clue about what has to be done. And this is also known under the name of the Lincoln Index. It's used in ecology to estimate animal population sizes. So we're going to capture, then we're going to mark the species, we will then release them, recapture, and recount and perform the calculation, which I'll show you how to do. The method of catching a wood mouse is to use what is known as a Longworth trap, and it's important here to be very clear with students that possession of a Longworth trap does not give you the right to trap animals like this. Indeed, in countries around the world, there's often legislation and laws about who can catch such animals with these techniques, the permission that you need, and indeed the training that you may also require prior to using this. So this isn't something that you should do with your school group unless you have all of the necessary permissions and skills training. The Longworth trap. Typically the Longworth trap, the animal enters into here and is captured in here, in the slot here. I'll talk about the ethics, some of the ethical considerations a little bit further along. So we're calculating the population size, which we'll designate as P for the mice. The sample area is the woodland, and what we would first do is we would set the Longworth traps, and then leave the traps in position for a period of time that we consider appropriate. And already we're getting into ethical issues here, because small animals have very high metabolic rates. And if you were to leave something like a wood mouse in a Longworth trap for particularly long, its metabolic rate would mean that it would probably die after a 24-hour period. And so you must return to the traps within time. At the back of a Longworth trap, in this location here, there's actually a small slit which allows things like shrews to escape, because shrews wouldn't even be able to survive a relatively brief capture time, because their metabolic rate means that they have to consume their own body weight in food over a very remarkably short period of time. So ethical considerations already. We capture our mice. These are images of mice that I've drawn. And what we now need to do is we need to put a mark on them. So we come back to ethics once more. The ethical considerations about the mark is that the mark should not affect the mortality of the mice. So putting a red marker on a mouse would certainly be unethical, since this would render them visible to predators. The typical technique is actually to cut the fur of the mouse, usually on the underside, and if you just snip the fur just a small bit, you leave it with a slightly lighter colored fur beneath, which is the initial mark, and of course in time, over a longer period of time, the fur will actually grow back and the mark would actually disappear. So that's a more ethical technique. So we capture our first sample, which is M, and we want to know what the numbers of mice are for that. So in my sample, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So now I have 5 mice. I've marked them, and now I'm going to release them. And the release is important because the purpose of the release is to allow them to disperse, to move away, and to separate themselves again out into the forest area, and to allow them to remix with the entire population. Having captured and marked, after a given period of time, then we would go to what's known as the recapture stage. And in my sample here, that's this group within this set here. So amongst the population of mice that we recapture, there will be many of them without a mark, and that gives us the number N. Remember, M was the original first capture, N is the second capture, and R represents those individuals in sample N which already had a mark on them. We would then move to calculate the population size by taking M and multiplying this by N divided by R. This is the Lincoln Index calculation used to estimate the population size. Of course, needless to say, having done so, you would then release the animals at the end of this process. So in my particular case, with 5 animals in the original sample, which is M, the second sample was 6, and of those 1 was a recapture. So our estimated population for the entire sample site is 30. Now there's a number of assumptions made in this method, and of course they are that we've got no immigration, we've got no natality, no birth rate, that there's no emigration, and there's no mortality. These 4 factors, of course, will influence the population size. Already we've done this, so that these would increase the population, and these, of course, would decrease the population. So the assumption is that this is not happening during our sample time. You might want to pause the video and consider, how could you improve the index? How could you improve the Lincoln Index? So perhaps you could pause this now and discuss that with your fellow students or someone. And the answer is that what we do is we move to a third sample, in which now we're going to, in the third sample, we would be sampling a population, but before we do so, we would have to put a mark on the second sample like this. And of course, this animal here would end up with 2 marks on it. So ethical considerations to be considered here to make sure that these marks don't make the animal vulnerable to predation or some other kind of factor affecting population size. The Lincoln Index, used to determine the size of sessile organisms like mice, and a reminder that the use of Longworth traps and this trapping technique is bound by legislation and local laws, wildlife laws. The link to the next video is appearing on the screen now. There's the possibility of subscribing to the channel and the playlist for population and community videos.